evening, everyone. It's great to see this turnout to hear Rick Tarnas talk about humanity's rite of passage. But first, let me say my name's Randy Morris. I'm a core faculty member at Antioch University and also President Emeritus of Rite of Passage Journeys. And this is the first event quite like this, sponsored by Rite of Passage Journeys. And but because it has the word rite of passage in it, it seemed highly appropriate someone like Rick to come along and really tell us that what's happening and what we're doing with youth and adults by taking them out into the wilderness and letting them go through a rite of passage process, that we learn what the psyche needs in order to transition from one worldview to another worldview. And the psychology of how that works is the exact psychology of how it's going to work at the collective level. And as all of us who are working in that field know, we're in a huge crisis right now, a crisis of worldviews, and we need people who have been initiated into being soulful leaders for that transition. And that's what we're trying to do at Rite of Passage Journeys, taking these junior high schooler and high school kids out in the summer. And so I'd like to introduce Rick Tarnas. This is the fourth or fifth time he's been speaking either at Antioch or for the Jung Society. It's a great honor to have him in town. The whole process of trying to imagine what we need to know in order to facilitate this transition into a new worldview requires people with a very powerful prophetic imagination. And when I think about what Richard Tarnas has to offer in his writing, The Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, this is precisely what we need to know. So like what's happening when we take rites of passage with youth as a microcosm of what the collective, so it is in his writing in The Passion of the Western Mind that we understand in the field of depth psychology that if you want to cure someone or if you want to heal someone, you have to understand something of their history. And what the Passion of the Western Mind teaches us, if we want to heal Western culture, we need to understand the history of ideas that shaped Western culture. And it's a very powerful book. I especially recommend the epilogue, the last 30 pages, incredible piece of work. So one of the great intellectuals of our time, personally, I believe, and as do many, I'd like to introduce Richard Tarnas.
Thank you. Very generous introduction, Randy. And I so admire the work you're doing here and the community that you are part of and the students that I've gotten to know. Just amazing. Very a kindred spirit personally, but also kindred communities. The one that I'm more embedded in the San Francisco Bay Area and here in Seattle. Always feel at home when I come here. So the basic, let me just ask to get a little handle on who I'm speaking with. I know some of you, but how many of you happen to have heard me up here on other occasions that I've been here in Seattle? Oh, good, about half. And how many have, let's say, happened to read Passion of the Western Mind? Again, about half. By the way, you can read the epilogue that Randy recommended just online. You don't have to buy the whole book, although it's just a paperback, so it's not that expensive. But you can read just that epilogue by, I think, if you go to the cosmosanpsyche.com website, cosmosanpsyche.com website, under the essays page, it's right there, epilogue to The Passion of the Western Mind. Well, the basic thesis or insight that I want to share with you this evening is that most of the most distinctive features and conditions of our postmodern planetary crisis, and I'll just allude to them briefly right now, just with headlines. That sense of the the deep decentering and dethroning of the established identity of the human being in this case, the widespread metaphysical, spiritual sense of disorientation, that sense of a great impending danger, both physical and spiritual, accompanied by a sense of really an encounter with mortality on a planetary scale. Let me add to that also that sense of deep uncertainty, kind of existential uncertainty, the sense of unknowingness, of not knowing the outcome of this tremendous crisis and process that we are involved in. The intense encounter with our moral shadow, and that sense of groping in the darkness that's got a whole philosophical background of the epistemological confusion, or at the very best, radical epistemological indeterminacy that characterizes the postmodern mind. All of these characteristics, and we could unpack more, but all of those can be seen as bearing an uncanny resemblance to the rites of passage, the experiences of people, individuals who are in initiatory rites of passage, or who have experiences quite spontaneously of, say, what Stan Groff has called spiritual emergencies, the perinatal death rebirth process, near-death experiences, certain critical stages of what Jung called the individuation process, of what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. All of these have a kind of underlying archetypal parallelism, a template that seems to be inflected in different ways, and that what individuals are going through in those profound experiences is something that we can see happening at the collective level, except that compared with, let's say, the great tribal traditional rites of passage that were characteristic of virtually all societies that we're familiar with prior to, all the primal indigenous societies. It starts to shift after the axial era, but is certainly marginalized altogether with modernity. In those societies, those rites of passage involved a separation that occurred and a kind of placing in isolation of the individual going through the rite of passage. And it's a separation from the tribe, from the community, from the mothers, framed in different ways. But by comparison, our moment in history and the particular spiritual, ecological, philosophical, religious, social, economic, political transformation and deconstruction of the old structures that's happening in our time involves a separation not from just the local tribe or community, but from the community of being itself, from the entire ensouled cosmos that, in a sense, what we might call the modern project. In some sense, Western civilization itself has been driving it. What used to be called with great with great pride and sort of unconsciousness of its bias, what used to be called man, modern man, etc., has in some sense, through its own intellectual, even psycho-spiritual evolution, differentiated itself out of the whole, out of the anima mundi, out of the ensouled matrix of being, the ensouled cosmos, from the earth community, and experienced itself as being separate from, superior to, eventually dissociated from, alienated from, objectifying of, and that therefore our transformative crisis involves not just this encounter with our own crisis of meaning as individuals, crisis of identity, encounter with personal danger or mortality, etc., but rather with the entire collective, in a sense, the entire Earth community has been catapulted into a catastrophic transformation. Let me give as a kind of classic example of the kind of initiatory process that I'm talking about. It's one that I happened to hear Joseph Campbell in 1970, so that's like, what, 35 years ago. He gave a lecture at Esalen, and in this lecture, he described a particular, it was a story, he was such a great storyteller, and he told the story of a North American shamanic initiation that the explorer Rasmussen reported. He was exploring the northern part of the North American continent, and he had conversations as he was traveling and exploring. He had conversations with a number of old shamans, one of whom told him the story of his own initiation as a young boy. And he said that he was taken by an older shaman out on a sled over ice and placed in a small igloo, just big enough for him to sit in, crouched on a skin. And he was left there for 30 days with a little water and meat being brought in to him twice during that period. And he said that he died a number of times during those 30 days, but he learned and found what can be found and learned only in the silence, away from the multitude, in the depths. He heard the voice of nature itself speak to him, and it spoke with the voice of a gentle motherly solicitude and affection. Or it sounded sometimes like children's voices, or sometimes like falling snow. And what it said was, "Do not be afraid of the universe." This discovery of a point of absolute security inside made possible his return to his community with a wisdom and an assurance that was unmatched by anyone else there, so that he could help others from that inner place, from that place of profound, kind of spiritual, cosmically grounded equilibrium that he had found by going so deep inside that he had accessed the archetypal forces of life and death, of death and rebirth itself, so that he could then perceive and speak and act from that deeper place. That's, I think, it's a very, I think, representative initiatory experience. Let me say just a few, let me spell out a few more ways in which, maybe I should put it this way, to unpack the ways in which the kind of postmodern situation and those different qualities that I listed, those features, those distinctive features of our time. Let me kind of specify them a little bit more. For example, that sense of the confrontation with our moral shadow. How many different forms this is taking in our time? For example, white people recognizing in ways that, I mean, remember, we're at that moment where the Selma to Ferguson arc, which is also an arc of history that has taken us from the civil rights movement, where one was attempting, where African Americans were attempting to be able to sit on the bus, to be able to eat in the diner, to our now having a president who is African American, and little black girls are running around the White House, well, not so little anymore, as their home. Whatever else we, reservations or approbations we may have about the Obama presidency, a revolution has happened that's irrevocable. A great moral development has taken place. And yet at the same time, even today, I think the white population in the United States is awakening to a new degree of awareness of the shadow of racism in our country, in the white way of being in the world. But think of it also, this encounter with the moral shadow in terms of the anthropocentric bias in our way of being in the world, where one only thinks in terms of human economic progress, or human dignity for that matter. That's where all the action is, and the rest of the world is a resource, is other non-human forms of life are there to be developed, exploited, objectified, owned for human benefit. And the tremendous awakening to and grieving as one takes in, and here we look at the planetary mortality encounter, where we're not just looking at our own mortality, as we all do in the course of our spiritual evolution, dark nights of the soul, but now in a way that's never, wasn't even true in World War II and the horrors of the first half of the 20th century. A whole nother thing is happening that is just unprecedented, as I don't have to tell you. The sixth extinction, the countless species we are losing year by year, the melting of the polar ice caps, the climate change, the flooding of entire island nations that is now occurring, and so forth. So there's it's at that level, it's at the civilizational level, the Eurocentric bias that's been awakened by our post-colonial, postmodern awareness. So just as deep ecology has helped awaken us to the anthropocentric bias, so has the post-colonial multicultural awareness of our era awakened us to the Eurocentric bias. And then there's patriarchy, the enormous suffering that has been caused by men acting consciously or unconsciously, usually unconsciously, and the effect on young girls and growing up and their self-images. There's part of the spiritual journey as individuals that I think every one of us in this room recognizes, that there is a certain important quality of emotion that involves mourning, grieving, and remorse that is now needing to be assimilated by the collective. It's each of us as individuals, but also on the collective level. I could talk, in other ways too. Christianity and its shadow, monotheism, religion itself, but science too and its shadow. Science, technology, the objectification of the world that's built into the mainstream scientific paradigm, commerce, business, corporate, objectifying exploitation of human beings as well as of the rest of nature, of non-human nature. So in all these ways we can see, I think, the truth of something that Octavio Paz, P-A-Z, the Mexican poet, said, of all places on the front pages of the New York Times Book Review some 20-some years ago. He said, the most powerful remedy for all the ills that face our civilization has been and will continue to be the examination of conscience and the remorse that accompanies it, which is as he put it, as a Mexican Catholic background, he said, which is a legacy of Christianity. I'd say it's a legacy of Christianity, Judaism, in some sense it's in all the great axial religions, but that examination of conscience and the remorse that accompanies it is the most powerful remedy for all the ills that face our civilization. So there's something about facing the shadow that's very, very crucial to this transformation. Jung pointed to this when he, in a letter, said, as he sometimes did in letters, he would just be very unguarded and even more eloquent because he was being more unguarded and precise. He was talking about male psychology, but he said as he often did, he didn't specify that's what he was talking about, as if it was all psychology. But what he said is, if the apprentice piece of psychological development is the encounter with the shadow, the masterpiece is the encounter with the anima. And another way of putting that in the kind of terms that I'm now talking about at the collective level, because he was talking about the individual level, essential to this initiatory transformation is that examination of conscience, that remorse, that grieving, that recognition of our shadow and the integration of it, the humbling that comes with it. And that, in turn, is part of a larger process that also involves the encounter with the anima, which, if we recognize the deeper collective level of that, that's the anima mundi. It's the soul of the world itself that we need to reconnect to, embrace, conjoin with, co-creatively come into intimate relationship with and participation with. And that involves taking this tremendous evolutionary process that we have been involved in historically for thousands of years, of this painstaking differentiation of consciousness. We can see it going all the way back to the, certainly to the evolution of the vertebrate brain. I'll say more about that in a second, because one could say that the Cartesian Newtonian mind is the apotheosis of the vertebrate brain. I'll spell that out in just a second. But this tremendous long evolutionary process, which didn't just start with Descartes. Descartes more like, not only was he expressing a more kind of collective historical emergence of a kind of consciousness in the 17th century, but he was also expressing and enacting an evolutionary process that had been in process for millennia, for millions of years, really. I mean, the more we study mammalian evolution, and then vertebrate evolution, and then even the evolution of life itself, you can see tremendous continuity in this long process of differentiating and empowering a nexus of discernment and volition, of mind and will, of nerve tissues and muscle tissues in the animal organism that becomes more and more differentiated, complexified, magnified, substantiated, empowered, elevated, until you get to this hyper-autonomous, powerful species, Homo sapiens, that is single-handedly, supposedly the most brilliant species the Earth has ever seen, and the most brilliant form of that species, modern civilization, and it's succeeding in so botching up the planetary biosphere that it's collapsing the Cenozoic era. That paradox is what we have to, probably all of us in this room kind of are basically living with and engaging that paradox day by day. And to see that what is necessary is a kind of radical deconstruction of that that hyper-separated identity, and yet preserving this tremendous evolutionary development in a certain way, and yet also transcending it. I mentioned the decentering and dethroning of that's involved in the postmodern sensibility. That was nicely summarized by Freud in one famous passage from the introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, where he said, there were three great wounding blows to, as he put it in German, man's megalomania and naive self-love. And those three wounding blows were the Copernican revolution, decentering the Earth, and therefore humanity from the cosmic, from the cosmos, its assumed role at the center of the universe. And then Darwin was the second. He mentioned Darwin and Wallace quite accurately. The decentering and dethronement as a species, not the divine center of all of creation, but one more ephemeral species, fallible, and having evolved from our shared ancestors with the chimpanzees and the rest of the primate kingdom. And then the third wounding blow, you can see a little egoism in Freud here, was psychoanalysis. But he had a point, and that was depth psychology, if we expand psychoanalysis to that term that encompasses Jung, William James, Tony Wolff, Sabina Spielrein, Marion Woodman, James Hillman, Stan Groff, transpersonal psychology, archetypal psychology, the much larger depth psychology phenomenon that has been one of the richest fruits of the marriage of the Enlightenment rational modern mind and the Romanticism's legacy coming from Goethe and Rousseau and Beethoven and so forth, Emerson, right up to the 60s counterculture that focused on the soul side instead of the mind side, that part of us that is capable of, that is more focused on the imagination, on the emotion, on our spiritual intuitions of deeper dimensions of reality, or of a numinous dimension of nature and the cosmos. That romanticism is a very important part of the modern sensibility. It's been englobed by the scientific, natural science, reductionist cosmos, that cosmology that is disenchanted. So you've got the romantic soul inside the disenchanted cosmos, and we also are all dealing with that paradox and contradiction, which I kind of spelled out a bit, I think, in the epilogue there, A Passion of the Western Mind. Well, depth psychology is kind of the fruit of that, the solar enlightenment and the lunar romanticism, and brought forth this very rich dispensation, as it's been called. But part of that dispensation was, as Freud put it, the dethronement of the rational ego, which realized that it was not master of its own house, that it was just an epiphenomenon of the instincts of the id, and a very tiny part of it, and it could easily be overruled, civilization and its discontents and so forth. So that's one way of framing that dethronement and so forth. But the dethronement of the human being that has been unfolding in the course of the later modern and postmodern period has taken many, many forms, which we could spell out in another talk. Nietzsche put it quite well when he said, it's as if modern humanity, ever since Copernicus, has been on an inclined plane, going out into the directionless chaos of the cosmos, with, how do you put it, a tremendous will to self-belittlement. Now, what I'd like to posit about that will to self-belittlement is that there's many things going on behind it, many motives, such as the rationalist who loves to secretly feel the superiority over all those other cultures and religions that thought that human beings were something special. Of course, the person who's saying that feels quite special that they are recognized that humanity is nothing special, and so there's all sorts of unconscious factors. But one big one that is, I don't think very often pointed to, but I would like to point out as relevant to what we're talking about tonight, which is that will to self-belittlement, all those ways in which the human being has been dethroned from its cosmic status, even dethroned since the modern mind and modern man's sense of confident progress, civilizational progress, onward and upward, that was going to go on forever just through the systematic development of human reason. That tremendous confidence that the modern civilizational project had. That's been, that dethronement, that belittlement, so apparent to us today in the ecological crisis, if nowhere else, where our own rationality has got us into such deep water. We can't help but see the shadow of our own project. All that, I think, that will to self-belittlement, that inclined plane, that free falling, to use the song by Tom Petty, great song. He captures that kind of postmodern angst of just free falling. It's both free, the autonomy, and it's falling. All that, I think, reflects this deeper initiatory process, that going down, that descent that has to happen for the transformation to take place. It's a descent into the unconscious. That's what depth psychology has brought about. It's a descent into the deep cosmos, which our cosmological discoveries are unpacking, are illuminating. It's a descent, a fall, really, from our old modern progress confidence, the descent from the Eurocentric, anthropocentric, patriarchal assumptions and biases and false superiority. So I'm wanting to save the phenomenon of that will to self-belittlement as actually serving a deeper purpose. It's part of a collective unconscious impulse to deflate from the inflation, so that it's part of the night sea journey that has to happen. We have to go down into the depths and be radically humbled. To grasp a little better this parallel, we need history. Randy mentioned that at the beginning about the importance of being able to glimpse that larger arc of the history of Western thought. Not because the West is the best, not because Western civilization is civilization as it used to think it was, per se, not because it's the only civilization worth paying attention to, exactly the opposite. We have to pay attention to Western civilization and Western culture's evolution and its history of ideas, because there is no part of the planet and no individual living or coming in these next generations who or which is not being profoundly affected by the assumptions and principles that have driven the Western civilizational project. We have to understand the West, and we have to understand modernity, because there is no island in the South Pacific or iceberg in the North or South Poles that is not directly undergoing consequences of modernity's cosmology, its understanding of the world, its objectification of nature, its conviction that about the nature of the human being. So to see this larger evolutionary logic, we need history. Daniel Burstein put it, trying to create the future without knowing history is like trying to plant cut flowers. But we also need to know our history and know the bigger history beyond just the West, because we need to recover and retrieve crucial insights that were available to earlier eras or to other cultures, but that have been eclipsed by the bright light of the modern mind, that have been marginalized and put into the shadow and suppressed. So the act of historical self-understanding is partly a diagnosis. It's partly a kind of etiology in the psychoanalytic sense. But it's also an act of retrieval, because there are moral and spiritual and philosophical and experiential resources and treasures that indigenous tribes and Asian religions and other animals have that we, and plants, that we need. And I believe part of this kind of postmodern great turning that we are going through, it's a kind of great turning at the bottom of the great spiral. Part of that great turning involves a profound opening to the wisdom of other sources of insight than those we have largely exclusively focused our energies on. Let me introduce one other concept, and that is the idea of the possibility that we might be entering a second axial era. Now, how many of you here are familiar with the idea of the first axial era or the axial era? A few. Okay, so this term was first used by Karl Jaspers, and then has been picked up by many historians of culture and of religion, of philosophy, etc. There's been some wonderful conferences about it and so forth. The axial era was basically in the first millennium BCE, but particularly centered in the 6th century BCE, when simultaneously across much of the world there was a sudden awakening to a new experience of the nature of reality that involved there being an insight into a transcendent dimension of existence that transcended this world in a certain way. The body, the archaic imperial state, which used to be identified with the divine, the pharaoh at the top, the divine king, etc. But now in Israel, in Greece, in China, in India, instead of there being the widespread archaic civilizational conviction that the divine was mediated to the rest of humanity by the pharaoh or by the king, who had a unique relationship with the divine, or was the divine himself, the god king, and at the top of the pyramid. And suddenly there was this disclosure. I mean, really, this happened in a matter of decades, that the Buddha and the beginning of Greek philosophy, the beginning of Taoism, Confucianism, Pythagoras, Thales, the great Hebrew prophets, Ezekiel and second Isaiah, all of whom pointed to Mahavira in India, as well as Gautama Buddha, possibly Zarathustra, though we don't know exactly the century that Zarathustra in Persia was living, but a lot of scholars think it was right then as well. But they all experienced a new way of understanding the nature of reality, in which there was one sovereign truth which relativized every other opinion or illusion or maya or shadow. There was the cave of shadows that Plato talked about, and then there was the true archetypal light where the philosopher who'd been illuminated had a glimpse of reality, the archetypal reality with a capital R. And from that position, he or she, and Plato was a proto-feminist in that way, could recognize that what the current government was saying was good and just was not necessarily good and just, but that there was a a spiritual, timeless principle of the good, capital G, that you could judge what was being called the good in this world, or justice, or beauty. There are many beautiful things in this world, but beauty comes and goes. The beautiful flower emerges, and then it wilts. But there is an archetypal idea of the beautiful, with a capital B, as it were, that all beautiful things and persons and experiences participate in and are informed by, with the Jewish prophets saying, yes, you're powerful, king, and you're saying what you say is just, but there is a king of kings that I have access to, by which I can judge your actions by a higher level of moral value. So in India, it was the mystic. In China, it was the sage. In Israel, it was the prophet. And in Greece, it was the philosopher. And in all of these axial transitions, it's called axial because this turning point, as it were, of human civilization brought about the beginnings of the world religions as we know them. Like Judaism was there before, but it became the way we know it now in that period. The beginnings of philosophy in Greece, as well as in India, and so forth, Buddhism, and right across the board, just a tremendous revolution of consciousness. And what it did was it democratized the access to the divine, to the spiritual, that had previously been held by the supreme leader in this state, and the state was divinized, and the state and the cosmos and the divine were all one. Eric Vogelin calls it the compact cosmology. And the axial age brought about this differentiation between this higher spiritual dimension that was the ultimate locus of value and meaning and purpose, and from this world, and it gave a leverage for transformation of the self and of the social political conditions, because those social political conditions were now seen as secular and not necessarily God's will. And the authority to be able to judge it did not come from the socially sanctioned, politically powerful. Okay, so the problem with that axial transition was that there was a kind of radical differentiation that took place between above and below, between spirit and matter, between heaven and earth. It also got intermingled with a radical separation between male and female, spirit, mind, the one over nature, matter, the many, the changing. It's like the changeless over the change, the eternal over time, etc. And so there was a shadow dimension to this great axial transformation that gradually evolved. I want to be conscious of there's no clocks here, so let me just see. So we started about 10 after, so okay. Our plan is to, after I set out a few more ideas here, and then Randy will come up and we'll break up into small groups for a short while, and then come back together again to discuss as a group, Q&A and so forth. So Let me give you an example of that way in which the patriarchal male-female, masculine-feminine hierarchy, polarization that happened, it got interlinked with this axial transcend. That's why you see it even in Buddhism, in Hinduism, Judaism, for all the tremendous moral, spiritual development, evolution that happened in all of them, Christianity, Islam, in varying ways, patriarchy runs right through them all. There's self-corrective impulses at work in all of them as well. That's part of the self-transcending moral development that is part of the axial gift. But that shadow is there. And let me give you an example of that. Billy Graham, probably the most well-known and influential Protestant preacher, spiritual leader in America of the 20th century. One day I happened to see the news in the early 1990s. I hadn't had any television in my life for about almost 20 years because I love living in Big Sur, where television signals didn't reach over the mountains there to the coast. Had its advantages. I could never have written Passion of the Western Mind if I hadn't been in that cocoon, basically. But when we came so that my children could start being able to be in more in schools and communities and so forth, we moved into Carmel Valley and we got television. One of the very first things I remember seeing was Václav Havel suddenly becoming president of Czechoslovakia, which was just this miracle. As 1990, late 89, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution. But a little while after that, I was watching the news, and a hurricane had come through the Carolinas, and Billy Graham was consoling a community there for its great loss, its losses of its homes, its churches, its way of life suddenly had been, destroyed by the hurricane. And he said, if we do not have faith in God the Father, we are going to be at the mercy of Mother Nature. By the way, see the disadvantage of, I was talking to some of the students and alumni earlier of essentializing the feminine as being, either nature and feeling or intuition or, relationality, etc., and the masculine as being, rationality and autonomous will and so forth. We know what is being got at by that, but then there's a big price that is paid if you start identifying Mother Nature and God the Father, which is a dominant mythos that has shaped our civilizational unconscious for centuries and centuries. Okay, so I think giving you a little bit of a sense, not that you needed to hear this from me, but I'm trying to highlight by these last few remarks how much the axial, and then the modern development of the axial, where the human being became all the more, autonomous in some sense, that special relationship that man had, being made in the image of God, then gets, once God dies, with the tremendous empowerment of the secular intellect in the course of the modern period, then man is at the top of the pyramid. It's the ultimate source of intelligence in the cosmos, of the known cosmos. And as that summum bonum, there's an obvious hubris and inflation. And that, at the same time, and this is what I was also trying to emphasize, how precious that autonomy is to us, how precious this capacity that each of us has as individuals has to find our own way to that divine center in us. That might be one way of putting it. How precious it is for us to not necessarily swallow hook, line, and sinker what the community is, what the community told us when we were growing up, or our parents, or our governing social paradigm, but to think for ourselves. So that autonomy is precious, and yet it has in some sense been purchased at the price of an alienation from the whole. And that tension of opposites is very much something in the Jungian sense that we're having to bear in order to bring forth that transcendent third that emerges when in the fullness of time, not through any decisive act of the ego's will, but rather through a mysterious process of interior exploration, our personal will, but also, could we call it grace? Could we call it the larger telos of the cosmos working through life and evolution and our own individual lives, but also our own collective lives? And don't we think each of us in this room who might have a sense that there's something about our individual lives that doesn't seem to be totally random? Like, it doesn't seem to have been completely accidental that we met this person at this time, or that these doors opened, or that that book came into my field at a certain point, and these ideas opened up my consciousness in a certain way, and then my life unfolded because of that relationship, or because of that insight, in ways that I wouldn't be able to make sense of my life in any other way. And we have a sense that there's almost a kind of benign artistry at work in our lives as individuals. I think many of us get that sense at a certain point, usually often accompanied by plenty of periods of profound doubt about ourselves and doubt about life and the cosmos itself. But it seems very characteristic of many people's individual journeys that they receive at a certain point a deep conviction that some other larger spiritual intentionality is at work in our lives. Jung called it the self archetype with a capital S. Nice way of getting around sounding too religious. If that's not, if that is true for ourselves as individuals, why would the divine stop there? Why would the inspirited cosmos just be interested in individuals, but not be interested in the fate of the earth or in the collective? Not that great losses and tragedies and deaths are not part of the whole. Indeed, they are, all the way. But when has a death not been part of a rebirth? When has a loss not been ultimately the seed of some larger fruitful unfolding that could not have happened in any other way? That kind of spiritual or perhaps even mystical intuition, I think, must be valid personally, and this is my mythos personally, but I know it's not mine alone, is, I believe, also relevant for understanding our history, understanding the collective development. Now, let me do a very quick, the board is here for a purpose. Some of you who have been in a lecture when I've come up here other times have seen this mandalic spiral of the evolution of worldviews.
Before. So here is the, I want to first differentiate the modern and the primal worldview. These will just be headlines. You guys are all so smart and well informed, I won't have to do much. So the primal worldview has a kind of permeable self in the world. So this is the worldview, the whole, and then the human self has a permeable embeddedness in the whole. And these diagonal lines represent where spirit and soul exist, where conscious intelligence and purpose and value exist. In the modern worldview, particularly from Descartes and Bacon and Locke and so forth onwards, all conscious. First of all, it's a highly differentiated self, and all conscious intelligence and purpose are experienced as residing in the human being, and the rest of the world is an object. So we are subjects in a world of objects. This is much more the state, this primal worldview is much more the state of participation mystique, that the self participates in the inner life of nature. The inner life of nature participates in the human being, and the divine saturates the whole thing. And particularly in the, as we know from studies of the Aboriginal experience, it's very much associated with the land and what we call ubayati, that is, the place is saturated with meaning, with stories, with divinity, and there's much less of a sense of separation between the tribe and the land, the animals, the plants, etc. Not only that, in ritual states, one can enter into the experience of animals, of plants. There is a kind of like what's called the pre-human flux in the Navajo tradition that one accesses in the dream time. Okay, and then you can see in this way that from here to here has been this enormous
evolutionary process over thousands of years that has essentially differentiated the human self, the subject, out of the whole. And that the entire anima mundi, the soul of the world, has been in some way kind of like a vacuum cleaner, pulled it into the human being, and only human beings have it. Like we're it, and the world is a world of objects that we can exploit for our own benefit.
In between was the great axial revolution, where the ultimate locus of value and purpose and intelligence and meaning was in a transcendent dimension. But the human being in the earth below, like heaven and earth, or Maya and Brahman, etc., had a special relationship to God or to the divine, different from the rest of nature.
Okay, and that helps prepare for this tremendous empowerment of the human. And then, like with the Renaissance and the Reformation, scientific revolution, there's this tremendous, almost like download of the descent of the divine into the human. You see it in Michelangelo's God on the Sistine Chapel, God touching Adam, and that moment of touching. That's the moment, right at that moment, the Copernican revolution is happening. Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo are getting the download of the scientifically expanded cosmos, and getting and the tremendous confidence that the modern mind received from that sense of, like, for the first time, we understand the structure of the cosmos. The earth is moving. Nobody believed that before, and now a whole civilization recognizes that the earth is moving, so we clearly have the most superior mindset ever. Okay, and in a sense there was this kind of... I'm tremendously compacting a larger exposition, but there was a kind of download, as it were, of the human being becoming the locus of that highest form of intelligence, purpose, and value. And there's where the inflation can come as well. And particularly as modernity develops and the divine ceases to have that immanent intimacy that for many people, particularly in the more hyper-rational executive ego, then you get the famous declaration of the death of God and the beginning of a whole nother, and we could now see the beginning of the postmodern movement, which I outlined at the beginning of this talk. Which
You can see now is a kind of descent, a kind of fall to the, let's see, I don't see an eraser, but if you could imagine that now this is the very tiny human being in the decentered Earth
and solar system and galaxy that's one amongst billions and billions and billions, and that we are just a meaning-seeking speck of dust in a vast cosmic void. As Nietzsche said, who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon that held us? Is there still any up or down? Is not night closing in on us, etc.? Okay, but part of the postmodern is not only that decentering and dethronement and all the things that I was describing at the beginning of this talk, the recognition of the shadow, the descent into the deep psyche, the unconscious, the encounter with the depths, the mortality, etc. But there's also intimations of intimations that a spiritual dimension does exist. It happens as people do their private wilderness journeys, or where they have an LSD session, or where they have a spontaneous awakening to the numinous dimension of life. It can take so many different forms. And there's also the recognition, part of postmodernity is recognizing that our reality is interpretive, that we are partially, deeply creating our reality by the assumptions and principles with which we approach it.
And so there's we look out and act out in the world, and then that in turn feeds back to us in a kind of recursive loop, so that
we're in a kind of act of world creation at the same time that the world is creating us. It's a recursive loop, so that then we have a kind of moral and epistemological responsibility in being co-creators of the world we live in. So part of postmodernity in its earlier stages in particular is a sense of profound disorientation and uncertainty and groping. But then another part of it is this sense of joyful taking of responsibility that we are the cosmos in human form, playing a crucial co-creative role in the unfolding of the whole. And that's one of the many nobilities of the postmodern era, The postmodern era is...
I put it down here. In many ways, it's the opposite of the axial because it's also a descent into the underworld, into the taboo. It's also a recovery of the
feminine, if we can hold that lightly. From the patriarchal side of the axial, it's a descent into recognition of our embeddedness in biological evolution, in our kinship with all the other animals and plants and life and the earth community, etc. And then there's a great uncertainty.
So there's these intimations of spiritual meaning. It's not all a disenchanted cosmos, this void. There's intimations of spiritual meaning, but there's also a big question mark that's part of
the postmodern. There's a sense of uncertainty. And if you think about the nature of an initiation, uncertainty is essential to it. If you know that it's all going to work out perfectly, there's no power to the transformation. You can't have a pretend near-death experience for it to work. It doesn't have the existential impact. It can't. You have to be uncertain about the result, and everything has to be at stake, as it is, as we are experiencing it today. It's very much part of the initiatory process. And what I believe is happening, I used to, when I was describing these different worldviews,
put this postmodern over here in a kind of like fourth place. And then I realized this is part of of a spiral where we
have this possibility. It's not just a circle of we need to recover the primal, but we don't just decimate the development of this differentiated, morally responsible, intellectually autonomous, relationally differentiated self. We need to simultaneously preserve and transcend it and come into relationship to the whole, to the anima mundi, etc. And so I'll just say a couple more words here about the second axial era and then Q&A. But Ewart Cousins was a Fordham philosopher who came up with the idea of, and in a sense, not the idea, but the intuition of an emerging second axial era. He was particularly focused on, the ecumenical developments of coming out of the 60s. He was, by the way, a close friend and colleague of Thomas Berry. They taught together there and influenced each other. Anyway, he's both dealing with, interreligious dialogue and ecumenism, but also with the ecological crisis. And he said, the consciousness of the 21st century will be global from two perspectives. And this is how he was defining the possibility of a second axial era. Compared with the first axial era, which had, Judaism and Buddhism and Christianity and Hinduism and so forth, all developing in their own particular ways, highly evolved and differentiated ethical, philosophical, religious structures and qualities apart from each other. And he said, now the consciousness of the 21st century will be global from two perspectives. One, from a horizontal perspective. The cultures and religions are meeting each other on the surface of the globe, entering into creative encounters that will produce a complexified collective consciousness. I think probably every one of us feels that here, how much, sometimes when I have to sign a form that says, what religion am I? I'll put down Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Taoist, shamanic, goddess religion, etc. Because they're all true. I mean, I feel deeply identified with, not just sympathetic to, but I can see through those eyes, and I feel they are living gifts. Anyway, that would happen. And then he says, from a vertical perspective, they must plunge their roots deep into the earth in order to provide a stable and secure base for future development. So there's a vertical dimension into the earth. This is partly that depth dimension, the going into the depths of the earth, the depths of the cosmos, instead of being the focus all up on the spirit of the axial or on man. See, what I'm describing here is we could call it a cosmotheanthropic imagination at work. Cosmos, theos, anthropos. Cosmotheanthropic picks up on a term that Raymond Panikar, one of my teachers at Harvard, but he was a kind of Catholic Hindu Spanish philosopher, died recently, and he's called it cosmotheandric. I don't know why he said theandric. Andric refers in Greek to men. Anyway, so that's why I say at least cosmotheanthropic to include more obviously all humans. But this is also the realm of the imagination and also of the earth. So it's all four are evolving right now. It's a huge kind of project of the animus mundi. And so when he said, from a vertical perspective, they must plunge their roots deep into the earth to provide a stable and secure base for future development. This new global consciousness must be organically ecological, supported by structures that will ensure justice and peace. In the second axial period, this twofold global consciousness is not only a creative possibility to enhance the 21st century, it is an absolute necessity if we are to survive. I would add that the vertical opening must also be not only deep downwards into the earth, but also deep inwards into the psyche. That's an essential part of the transformation, of the great turning. And also deep outwards into the cosmos to provide a more encompassing cosmic context for humanity's spiritual aspirations and self-knowledge. That's a whole other part of my work. Like into the soul of the cosmos, which is our own soul. But there's one more thing I want to add about that second axial age, and that is if we understand how the first axial age brought about that democratization of the access to the divine from the top of the pyramid that the pharaoh or the king or the top of the hierarchy had either the exclusive access to the divine and then mediated it through grand ritual, etc., to the rest of the, and this was all unquestioned. That numinosity that collects around the higher parts of like the aristocracy or the royalty, you still have it like in England. There's still like a kind of numinosity around the royal family, even though it's been totally all too humanized. There's a numinosity there. Those of you who watch Downton Abbey, that you're seeing at work there in the first half of the 20th century, this dissolution or deconstruction of that old archaic hierarchy where there's a kind of numinosity that surrounds the upper class, which comes from this earlier
archaic stage in between here and here, where there was this pyramid of spiritual dignity with the divine at the top, etc. Anyway, that's a whole other lecture.
But my main point with respect to the second axial era is that what I believe now is required is a radical democratization of spiritual dignity to all beings. It was a big step to give it to all human beings in principle that the Axial did, though it was very tended towards both the patriarchal and also towards its own religion in exclusivist ways. But it still broke through out of the compact cosmology of the archaic civilizations. But we need a radical democratization of spiritual dignity to all beings, which I think is spontaneously emerging in many of our lives and sensibility. And I'll just finish by quoting Thomas Berry, a quote that is on the bottom of any email you might happen to get from Randy, because Randy includes it. But this is, when I read it, I thought, what a perfect description of this democratization of spiritual dignity to all beings, to the cosmos and all its manifestations. This is Thomas Berry from The Dream of the Earth. Interior articulation of its own reality is the immediate responsibility of every being. Every being has its own interior, its self, its mystery, its numinous aspect. To deprive any being of this sacred quality is to disrupt the larger order of the universe. Reverence will be total, or it will not be at all. Now, Thomas is not gesturing towards the way I have wanted to tonight, the degree to which not only is this numinosity to be restored to the whole, but also I believe, in order to be true and faithful to the whole, we have to be true also to our own history and to the fact that the cosmos has evolved through us in a particular way that puts us at a particular time of moral and spiritual transformation that our rite of passage is now putting us through the crucial threshold for, so that it's not just a matter of going back to the primal, it's entering back into the relationship to the whole, but in a sacred marriage, as it were, of the solar and the lunar, the heroic solar journey, returning into the co-creative marriage with the whole. Okay, that's all I'll say for now, and then we'll please come up, Randy, and we'll go from there. Let me begin with, Randy reminded me, I was saying that the notion of the first axial era, or of the axial era, it wasn't thought of as first or second, it was the axial era, came from Karl Jaspers. What is it? It's the origin and goal of history, or that came out in the later 40s. And it gives me an excuse to mention what I think is one of the most useful and important works of scholarship that have come out in the last few years, is by the late Robert Bellah. It's spelled B-E-L-L-A-H, Robert Bellah. And after he wrote it for his last 14 years of his life, and then published it in his 80s. And it's called Religion in Human Evolution. Religion in Human Evolution. He was from the Paleolithic to the Axial Era is the subtitle. Harvard University Press, 2011. Great book. It's a big one, but it's a multidisciplinary masterpiece that many scholars are being influenced by. My entire faculty read it and thrilled, and it's very seminal. Okay, so what an active dialogue was going on amongst all of you. I told Randy, I don't know if we want to stop this. I mean, but it's nice to collect together again, and I'd love to hear any thoughts, comments, questions, and so forth. And before we end, I do want to say something about heroic communities, which I think this is, and the crucial significance of such communities in this critical period. But I'll save that for towards the end. Any thoughts, comments, questions, please?
In our group, I was listening to some of my elders and hearing their anxiety about if there is hope, if this change can come about.
I think having that anxiety is it's completely realistic. In some way, it feels like it's too late for us in a certain way. So things have gone too far. They could have been turned around 20 years ago and weren't. Still, things can be turned around, and in some respects that will be very life-enhancing if they can be. But I don't think there are grounds particularly for a kind of disenchanted rational optimism. But I think there are grounds for hope in the sense of hope being different than optimism. It's a theological virtue in a sense, and it rests on more than our reason or our direct observation can necessarily give us grounds for. It rests on some deeper sense of larger benevolence and intentionalities that we may have seen at work in our own lives when we were most sure that they didn't exist. And yet, not to get too, sermon-like, but there is something about that individual spiritual experience of grace that if it is something that happens to individuals, it's hard to think that the interests of the Godhead stop there. I'm not saying that we're going to see the flourishing of human civilization and the species of the earth in the form that we in our current form would like to see if we could have our druthers. We're all going to die individually. That we can be pretty sure of. And it's possible that whole ways of life, certainly already whole species are dying. I have a certain sense of confidence I have a deep sense of confidence in the cosmos's creativity. And the creativity is always, that's the mystery of like the scarab coming out of the dung heap and signaling the rebirth of the sun out of the deep night. That experience which so many people have had that is so central to the initiatory mystery, I have faith that the fate of the earth is also in the same hands. I can't say it will necessarily retain everything that I personally would like to see it retain, but I know that I've lost things this lifetime. Sure that my life would be irrevocably impoverished because I've lost that, whatever it might have been. And yet, as a result of absorbing that loss, gifts came that could never have come otherwise. Anyway, that's the best I can say. Yeah, great. Please wait in the back.
I was thinking about the night journey and the trip through the underworld and the shamanic dissolution, dismemberment process. And often in those cases, there's a fall into psychosis. It's irretrievable at times, and then there can be, if the psyche can withhold the ordeal, come out of that situation and bring the gift back to the community. And so we were talking in our group that, are we in a state of psychosis right now? If that could be, that seems really likely. And also, I mean, on an individual level, how do, that would translate into the collective, how do we avoid psychosis on a collective level while bearing witness to the tremendous tragedies that we are facing?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I didn't mention, but it gives me a chance to point out, like part of the descent, and it is a kind of creative descent that I think we're going through, involves the facing of insanity, of a kind of madness. It's the loss of existential certainty, including your very sense of what is the nature of reality. And in that sense, you could say that Nietzsche and like Virginia Woolf, they're kind of like paradigm figures of the postmodern descent into madness. And eco-psychologists have pointed out the madness of our civilization. It is a kind of psychosis, this total dissociation from the matrix of our being, the suicidal impulse, the suppressed depression that we're acting out through a manic inflation, etc. And I think the radical psychiatry movement, where people like R.D. Laing and others were pointing out that the insane person is in some ways the only sane person, because they're opting out of the insane society that is running the show. I think it's very helpful to have a paradigm in mind, drawing from depth psychology. I think the work of Stan Grof is extremely helpful here. He and Christina, his wife, coined the term spiritual emergency. I think you could read a book of theirs called The Stormy Search for Self. There's also an anthology called Spiritual Emergency that a number of people contributed to. But it's the idea that the kind of deconstruction of personality, of reality perception and testing that happens in psychosis is often a profound process of consciousness transformation that permits a kind of psychospiritual rebirth that is profound. And that if in fact you look at a lot of conventional secular psychiatric literature, they talk about the different founders of religion, like the Buddha or Jesus and others, as being, whatever, ambulatory schizophrenics and so forth. Freudians called Jung that. And Jung himself, felt that he was losing his sanity when in that 1913 to 1918 period that the Red Book came out of. And all of his work came out of that time period, all of his insights, etc. And he not only felt it overwhelming him, he also invited it. He sensed that there was a treasure there. He sensed that there was something worth risking everything for. So that's part of the death rebirth process. Is in fact an encounter with madness or insanity. Those people who do work with entheogens or psychedelic therapy or ayahuasca, LSD, etc., often have to face a very powerful experience like that, and it's because Tim Leary did not do the greatest job of preparing a whole generation to do those kinds of experiences. You're just whatever at an acid test or something like that. There's going to be a certain number of people who are experiencing things like that who have had no preparation for it. They don't have a shaman, a guide. Albert Hoffman, who who invented LSD, said once when we had a conference on psychedelics at Esalen, and he said, the whole reason it caused there's such a reaction against LSD, and it caused, in a way, a kind of social catastrophe at the same time as it seeded the whole 60s countercultural revolution. Many of us wouldn't be in this room if psychedelics hadn't transformed the consciousness of thousands and thousands of people, especially many of the leaders of the 60s kind of consciousness revolution. But Albert Hoffman said, we did not, as a civilization, have adequate structures of sacred ritual that could provide an appropriate container for that powerful a medicine. While all these societies like in Africa and South America or North America, et cetera, have for millennia been using very powerful vision plants and psychedelic medicines, psychoactive substances. And having that kind of experience is pretty much par for the course at a certain level of depth of transformation. And yet that's where it's only really when you let go that the great healing can take place. If you're in control, you can't have the same kind of healing as if that you can get if you let go, including of your very sense of what's real and your sense of identity, which is connected to your sense of what's real. That's where insanity lies. But when people take it and they don't have a context for it, and then they're locked into their fears, they're in a panic, and they get Thorazine or brought into an institution or hospital. Also they get locked into it and they have flashbacks. They don't work it through. As Stan says, it's the full experience of the negative emotion. It's the funeral pyre of that emotion. That's the only way through it is through it and not suppressing it. So how many of our great artists, our great spiritual leaders have gone through that kind of experience? Meher Baba, the different, mystics, etc. So, yes, I think collectively we are going through something like that, and it's an essential part of that descent, that loss, that deconstruction of the old identity and reality, which is necessary for everything to become whole again on another level. There's a beautiful song by, of all people, Steely Dan, called Any Major Dude. Any major dude will tell you when everything's falling apart, and the demon's knocking at the door, the next morning it won't be there anymore. Everything will come together in another way. The Grateful Dead have a lot of songs about that too. Ripple, and the whole second half of the whole American Beauty album has many spiritual depths in that. Anyway, those are a few thoughts about it. Thank you. Please.
I've been thinking about this in our small conversation, and you mentioned North America, South America, and Africa, sort of south of the Sahara there, where that piece of... But when you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, sort of the whole axial age, none of those places were part of that axial age. It was sort of Europe and Mediterranean and Asia and maybe Africa north of the Sahara. And all the way through Asia. So I'm kind of curious if there's some relationship there. That was my question. I was like, well, I don't know. Nowadays, when we talk about rites of passage, we go to the North American, South American, and African cultures.
Or Aboriginal in
Aboriginal
Australia.
in Australia, right? Another place that wasn't part of the axial thing. So there seems to be a conversation there. And in terms of this cycle, I think those cultures, from my experience, I work in programming for rites of passage, and so there's lots of stuff written, and we had a chance to actually work with some elders from Native North America and Polynesia. And to read the discoverers and the explorers from the axial cultures who then encountered these worlds, they were like children looking it up at us in awe, right, from those reports. We were the gods or whatever.
Right.
But now you go meet those elders, and they look at us like we're the children.
Yes.
And so they kind of nod, and if we were to say, like, yes, our modern Western culture is going through a rite of passage, they'd be like, yes,
Yeah.
you are adolescents, and you're burning down the whole world because you need to go through a rite of passage that we've already figured out.
Yes. Yeah. Everything that you say is I agree with, and of course Europe and Russia and China, India, they all had primal, before the axial revolution took place, they also, the shamanic and indigenous and primal cultures were very widespread there as well. And there's been attempts to retrieve that. Ralph Metzner on European, old European wisdom cultures, and of course in Siberia it's still there, etc. There are ways in which the axial related cultures that then, particularly coming out of Greece and Israel, created modernity, have developed. Yes, there's certain ways in which this whole evolution puts us. We're the young kids who are like. We're like adolescents compared to the ones who are thinking 7 generations hence. The initiated, many people have pointed out how much our culture not having initiatory rituals means nobody's come into maturity. They're nations of adolescents. Just watch, most of our blockbuster movies or commercials during the Super Bowl, if that's a time, and you get a sense for just how adolescent the culture is. It's being run by adolescents rather than adults. Everybody's thinking of the short-term bottom line rather than many generations into the future. So in that way, don't we look like an inflated 3-year-old or adolescent? Narcissistic, etc., short-term thinking, compared to the primal wisdom of those cultures. And that's not the whole story. And there's been, for example, the whole axial and modern developments also have a moral dimension that is very real. The urge for universal benevolence and the respect and dignity of all human beings, and the urge to minimize the suffering of others in a universal way, and to have one's developing knowledge serve the improvement of all human beings' lives, and certain elements of egalitarian social justice, even feminism, breaking out of social roles that are not just part of the way things have always been, but instead are giving each girl and boy, man and woman, an opportunity to individuate in a unique way. The urge to have a tolerance of many worldviews and feel that one needs to negate the tribe across the river because they have a different belief system, or because they're not even human. We don't want to idealize any. I mean, there's great wisdom as well as shadow in every stage. And what I'm pointing to now is that part of the nobility of the postmodern is the radical opening to pluralism, multiplicity, and our need to listen to the wisdom traditions coming from many sources, including not the non-human, the more than human. How much we can learn from trees, how much we can learn from whales. I think the awakening to the wisdom of the cultures that have been suppressed, negated, marginalized, and even lost in history is part of the necessary movement towards wholeness and health that we need to go through as a civilization. Anyway, that's a few thoughts in relationship to your question. It's a very, very good one and comment. Please, and then you. And was there anybody else that's had their hand up for a while? And please, okay. So we'll do those three, and then we'll see what our time is.
I'm just curious, you bring up, we've talked about nature a lot, obviously, because we are, in fact, in it. It's a part of this whole discussion tonight. But in going through this process to kind of get back to where we're actually coming from, is kind of the idea. Is it, how necessary is it, do you believe, and to what degree, for us to really have, we as in people, those of us here in all of humanity, truly raw and open natural experiences, like actually in the outdoors, not just intellectual, not just philosophical or spiritual, but to actually be realize how significant but insignificant we are, like actually in the natural world? Is this a crucial part of the rite of passage? Because in a lot of shamanistic traditions, there's the igloo out in the tundra or whatever. Is this absolutely a part of that, collectively?
I can't say collectively how we're all going to have that experience in the igloo. I know that in my own journey, it was definitely me alone in, I don't even want to say like in nature. I mean, it was the Big Sur wilderness, but we are nature, of course, too. We're a form of nature that's done a very unusual thing. And it was also using sacred medicine, which played a huge role for me all during, in the years of my kind of, I was going to say formation. I'm always being formed as I trip, as I go down the stairs. But you ask a good question about like, where do you go to like the wilderness? Where can you go where you're not going to hear a 747 flying overhead deep in the Sierras or whatever? It's and yet there is still, just in my backyard, I watch carefully and learn from the squirrels, the lizards, the amphibians, like the little newts and salamanders, and I look and I see those little salamanders and newts. They're tetrapods. They've got arms and legs that bend just the way ours do. And the way we move is because our common ancestor came out of the sea and developed those limbs and those lungs. And they're my brothers and sisters, as I'm looking at them. And so that encounter with the wisdom and the tremendous evolutionary project and mystery of Earth's evolution is available in my own little backyard. So it's just the consciousness that one brings to whatever little postage stamp we've got available to us. But you guys here, as I in California, you've got just within, a short drive, incredible opportunities for engagement with with the depths of nature. And hopefully much more will be recovered and restored as a result of our taking in its richness. Who did I say was next? You and then you, yes.
You talked a lot about the axial age and then this second axial age coming, and that time, the axial age was such a violent, warring time, and it seems like we're here now in a very violent, warring time as well. And my question is, how does one have a cosmic, is there a necessity for this transcendence with violence? I mean, what is the correlation? What is that relationship? Yeah. And how does one have a cosmic relationship with the violence?
Well, of course, like Gautama Buddha and Jesus and Confucius and Socrates were not, to our knowledge, particularly violent people, and they. But the violence of those eras was part of the environment within which the birth of the axial era took place. And it, by the way, it tended to take place not at the centers of the great empires, but on the outskirts. You know, the outskirts of the Roman Empire. You know, or the and birth, particularly human birth, with our large brains and our bipedal erect posture and the size of the pelvis and the pain that is involved in childbirth means that birth in most cases is experienced for the infant in particular as having a certain violence. That's what the perinatal psychology has kind of opened up, and integrating that level of intense experience of both being a victim and also having tremendous rage as you're being, you can't breathe, the umbilical cord is being squeezed, the oxygen's not coming in, the being that you thought was thought in quotes was this, you were the loving, beloved center of its cosmos, and now you're being expelled by that being ruthlessly by these powerful forces, and etc. Birth seems to involve a kind of sacrifice of the old universe in order for the new one to be born. And part of I think we're working very hard in different disciplines and medical practices and so forth to recover a lot of the ways in which birth could be less violent. I think it's part of, anyway, that's a whole other subject, but I'm wanting to show you the parallel between the fact that birth of something, of a new being, involves the destruction of the old matrix, and violent energies get activated. It's not something I'm comfortable with. One thing I'd like to point out is that it seems that a lot of what's behind kind of fundamentalist terrorism, on the one hand, it can reflect the sense of having been shamed, and there's a lot of, I think particularly in a lot of the Islamist radical movements, there's a lot of shame that is being ragefully expressed and discharged after having been how it's been treated by the modern West, etc., Christianity, Crusades, and so forth. But there's another level to it, and that is that fundamentalists have had very often an experience of the numinous, and it comes in a certain way. And that particular way, whether it was reading the Quran or getting inspired by a passage in the Bible or hearing a preacher, whatever form it would take, that sense of the numinous of the sacred is so precious. It's so much more important than anything else that's happened in that person's life, and it seems to redeem their life in a certain way, that one holds on to that for dear life, because that's your connection to the axial transcendent, or that's your connection to meaning, to your living a meaningful life, to you having an identity that's worthwhile. And if that experience has for many reasons, if it's limited to that, then anything that seems to threaten that is demonic. It's like, I'll kill you rather than have God or the sacred or Allah or whatever profaned or threatened by you. I'll sacrifice my own life rather than have that, etc. So there is, if we think of the collective psyche of the whole human race right now as one psyche, what is being said by these violent voices? And it has something to do with we need to hold on to the sacred against the onslaught of a disenchanting secular juggernaut that is trying to take over the world and eliminate a higher meaning. So there's there's a cry, a cri de coeur on behalf of the sacred, mixed up with the shadow of sadistic, aggressive rage and vengeance and so forth. But the violence, it's in the cosmos. It's in nature. The big extinctions of species across the globe have happened before Homo sapiens or anything like hominins ever existed. It's part of the mystery of the whole. I can't say I'm comfortable with that personally, but I'd like to see the lion and the lamb all lay down together in the long run, and perhaps that happens in some other dimension of being. But we do live in a cosmos where the opposites, including the most intense violence and the most tender love, exist in some peculiar marriage of opposites. It's a mystery. One more, I think, and then we...
If humanity is ever able to make the cultural changes to move back to sort of revitalized first circle over there and embrace a spirituality that includes other beings, what do you think will be the most important sort of cultural transformation or the fountainhead of that change? Is it like a new religion? Is it a revitalized core to other religions? Is it the visions of poets and artists? Is it social and political changes? Is there a dynamic, a YouTube video that goes viral?
Yeah, you're right. People used to think it was going to be LSD, or MDMA, Probably all of the things that you mentioned will be part of it, and things that we don't know about yet can emerge. The collective psyche goes through spontaneous transmutations, sometimes very rapidly, in the same way that we as individuals sometimes can go through quite in the fullness of time, at the right hour, at the kairos moment, as Jung called that, that the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental symbols and principles. Something is going to have to shift in our symbol systems, which which inform and are expressive of our psyche, which is the collective psyche, but which is also therefore the anima mundi, the cosmic psyche in some sense. And that's always evolving and changing, and sometimes the change can happen very rapidly. And when it happens, everything shifts. The technology shifts, the epistemologies shift, the social structures shift, the art, the poetry, the music. Boy, music plays a huge role in affecting, you know, the collective mood of a civilization. Again, you couldn't understand the revolution of the '60s without the music, and if nobody knew what the music was, they would miss, like, that was almost at the essence of what happened, even though many other things were happening, but it was carried. And the people, the men and women who were at the front of the civil rights movement, and they'd have their 3-hour meetings at night, getting ready for the next confrontation with the police in the South. This is the early '60s. I was hearing one of the people who were part of they said, of those 3 hours, 1 hour was talking, preparing for, you know, the strategies, the nonviolent approach, et cetera. The other 2 hours, this is late at night after they'd all worked everything, the other 2 hours were singing. And it was absolutely essential to it. Probably I think the arts are, in some ways, just as, the arts and the religion, the science, they were all one together here. And they get much more differentiated with the modern. And I think right now it's interesting with science, religion, and philosophy all having lost their sovereignty at the top of the culture's authority in their own way. It's the arts that have a certain authority right now. We listen to what great poets, musicians, they're bringing epiphanies. People used to listen to Bob Dylan in between 1964 and '69 the way one would have listened to a prophet in ancient Israel. Like, what's he saying? There's something deep there. And there was something deep there. And he was seeing stuff that he himself felt like something's coming. I didn't even know everything that I was saying, but he was a vessel. So the imagination, the creative artistic imagination, is an essential part of what I think could play a crucial role in our transformation. Let me just finish with a note about, thank you for that thought and question. Let me just say something about heroic communities. This transformation we can't go through we can't do it as individuals. If there is one task of our time, it's to develop a moral and imaginative vision for the future of our planetary culture that is connected to the cosmos itself. And heroic communities, I'm using the word heroic the way Charles Taylor talks about. It's that where the individual who has a vision of a higher good and dimension of the good than the rest of the society, and helps to transform that society through that vision. And we've had a focus in the West on individuals doing that, the prophet, the philosopher, Socrates, etc. But we in our postmodern era, where the entire horizon of meaning has been erased, and we're in this kind of state of free falling, we are fundamentally in a state of seeking in a world that doesn't have any pre-given structures of meaning and purpose embodied in the cosmos that are publicly accessible and that are embodied in the structures of the society. We're all by necessity on a quest. And in that sense, what's really emerged, I think, in our time is how crucial it is for communities to be heroic. Because if you live in a vast cosmological void, you cannot create and sustain a re-enchanted cosmology on your own, like the Atlas archetype, carrying it by yourself. We absolutely need to have communities that can together sustain the enormous act of the spiritual and intellectual and empathic imagination that can vivify and co-creatively participate in the reawakening of a meaningful universe. Only a community can hold space for something like that, and particularly not only because to be able to hold the ideas and discuss them and vivify them in that way, but just emotionally and spiritually, the communities hold space because the journey is a difficult one and a perilous one individually that we have to go through. And we need each other to hold space as we go through these rites of passage, these initiations, these spontaneous descents and transformations. So in one way, we have to overcome this individual heroic lone cowboy kind of mentality that is built into our society's value system. But we also need it, but we need it because we do need to hold a vision of the good that clearly our mainstream disenchanted society is not holding. But we need to do that in communities. And I think a lot of it comes down to the depth of initiation that a community can hold space for its individuals to go through, so that there's an individual. It's not, and it has to be permeable to the whole, so that it's not a cult. It has to be able to keep taking in the larger whole and the vocabulary and the realities of the larger society. It's also got to hold space for individual, not just there's not just one way. Every one of us is a way, and we need them all. Okay, well, that's a long night. You guys have been incredibly patient. Thanks a lot.